Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Today is our last lecture. And if you don't miss me, I hope some of you do, I will certainly miss talking to you every day. लेकिन अलविदा की बातें भी इंशाल्लाह आखिर में होंगी. We still have some unfinished business to attend to from our previous lecture. So let's wind up whatever is left and then we'll talk about the future. So let's start talking about fixed versus floating exchange rates, which was the last topic we were dealing in international finance. Now the history of fixed versus floating exchange rates is as follows. Until 1973, the world had a system of fixed exchange rates. It was called the Bretton Woods system. It collapsed in that year. And since then, we've had a system of floating exchange rates, that is, exchange rates which can go up and down. Now, the inherent disadvantages of a floating exchange rate system are that it causes uncertainty for traders. Traders who want to export their goods, import their goods, also foreign investors who want to make investments, even domestic investors when they want to undertake some investments abroad or buy some capital machinery. All of these decisions are affected adversely by exchange rate volatility. And therefore, from the 1980s and in the 1990s, there were moves again to move to some kind of a fixed exchange rate system. Now, many countries in this, recognizing this need, introduced pegs. Pegs are fixed exchange rate systems where you tie your currency to some foreign currency. So, some of these countries tied their currencies to the US dollar. So, their exchange rate vis-a-vis the US dollar was fixed. However, in the 1990s, we saw the rise of a particular class of financial analysts and financial people called arbitrageurs and speculators. And the task of these people was, or at least the de facto role that they assumed in the 1990s, was that they caused unnecessary volatility in many of these countries, especially developing countries. Now, the way these speculators operate is that they form expectations about a certain currency. So let's take the example of the Thai baht. This is a currency which collapsed in 1997. So these speculators, which have a lot of financial capital with them, they form expectations about what would happen to the Thai baht. Let's say the Thai baht is pegged to the US dollar, and the government is committed to maintaining that exchange rate at its fixed level. But if these speculators or arbitrageurs or these group of financial gurus, if they decide or form expectations that the Thai baht is going to collapse, that is, the peg will be removed and the currency would devalue because of some underlying weaknesses in the economy or something, then they would act on those expectations. That is, they would start withdrawing money from the economy or conduct financial transactions in a way so as to increase the demand for dollars and increase the supply of bahts. And the actions of these speculators would cause the expectations that they had originally formed to be realized, that is, to be fulfilled. And these are broadly called self-fulfilling crises. The crises that happened in East Asia fell in this category. That is, expectations were formed about where a particular currency might go. Then the people who had formed the expectations acted on those expectations. And because they were a very powerful, financially powerful group, then by virtue of their expectations, they caused their expectations to be realized. Now, when a developing country is faced with such powerful, large, powerful speculative groups, then it's difficult for the developing country, which is a small country, to defend itself against such groups. So, developing countries or smaller countries have a dilemma that before them. On the one hand, they do not want flexible exchange rates, which on the one hand cause volatility and cause their trade and investment transactions to suffer. And also, if a country has a large foreign debt, then floating exchange rates can cause the level of debt to expand. But on the other hand, they do not want to get into problems where pegs are made and pegs are attacked by speculators, and that could plunge the economy into financial crisis. So how do you balance this dilemma? Some people have argued that the answer lies in capital controls. That is, countries should maintain fixed exchange rates but not have free capital mobility, that is, impose capital controls. Capital controls are simply ways to restrict the inflow or outflow of capital from an economy. So if the government wants to, let's say, set interest rates domestically that are higher than foreign interest rates, then it can discourage the inflow of capital by imposing restrictions on the amount that can come in, or it can impose a tax on the inflows so that the inflows are discouraged at source. Similarly, if the authorities wanted to maintain an interest rate in the economy which was low, the international interest rate, then it could sustain those by imposing controls on outflows of capital. Therefore, it would force capital to remain within the country. The main problem with these controls is their enforcement. It is very difficult to enforce these controls because you're trying to stop people from taking advantage of an opportunity which exists before them. So if domestic interest rates are higher than foreign interest rates and foreigners want to take advantage of this, then by hook or by crook, they'll find a way to take advantage of these, either through over-invoicing and under-invoicing of trade transactions or various other means. And these are explained in your lecture handouts. Similarly, if people want to take their money out of an economy, then you can't really stop them. They'll either find legal channels or illegal channels to get their money out. So the main problem with capital controls is enforcement. There are also credibility issues. When a country imposes capital controls, the world investment community might not view that favorably. They might think the economy or the government is trying to turn the clock back. Capital controls were something that belonged to the old ages. They are not something which go or consistently with the global village idea of the world that we have developed. There is another way to resolve this dilemma as well. This dilemma that countries want to maintain fixed exchange rates but do not want to be attacked by speculators. That is, they do not want attacks against that fixed exchange rate. One way out of this is monetary union, regional monetary union. And this has happened in the European Union, for example. Many European countries have gotten together and adopted the euro. So they've given up their individual currencies and adopted a single currency. This is the case where a number of countries have sat together and volunteered to join or form a monetary union, a bloc. But this linking of one's currency or removing one's currency in favor of another currency can also be a unilateral decision. And Ecuador is an example of a country which has done this. This is called dollarization or euroization. What is done in this case is that the entire stock of local currency is purchased back and replaced with dollars. So dollars or euros become the currency in the economy. There is no local currency. And because there is no local currency, there is no need for a central bank either. Because once you adopt another country's currency, you basically adopt the other country's central bank as well. And this is highlighted as one of the major problems of dollarization, that is unilaterally joining another currency. And the argument here is that central banks are usually the lenders of last resort, the anchors of stability, financial stability in an economy. And when you have a country, a small country, linking up to the currency of a big country, the big country's central bank does not have any interest to look after the interests of the small country which has adopted its currency. So this is again a dilemma that many policymakers face. I think this is one that will continue to haunt policymakers in the next couple of decades at least. So my friends, that was a brief discussion of some issues relating to fixed exchange rates, floating exchange rates, capital controls, monetary union, that it's good for you to know about. Certainly once you look at international trade and finance issues in detail in a subsequent course, these things will become clearer to you. This brings us to the end of our discussion on international finance. Brief but to the point. Now we look at the final part of our course. That is look at the problems of lower income countries. Why do I call them lower income countries and not developing countries or less developed countries? Now, I've used those terms myself, and those terms are commonly used. But generally, I prefer using the term lower income countries. And the reason for that is that it is not necessary for any country which has a lower income to be also less developed in the other senses as well, right? A country can be more developed not just in terms of its finances or its economy, but in terms of its political structure, socially, morally, etc., etc. So calling poor countries less developed is tantamount to passing a normative statement to the effect that economic development or the level of income of a country should be the only criterion for its development. Anyway, that's a separate debate. What are the problems of poor countries? Why are poor countries poor? Let's first look at what the nature of the problem is, the degree of the problem is. The nature of the problem is that poor countries have remained poor for a long time. Once they got independence, many countries got their independence from colonial powers in the 1940s and 50s, and some in the 1960s. But they haven't been able to graduate from their state of underdevelopment that existed, economic underdevelopment that existed at that time. And this has been the focus of the attention of many over the past few decades. Now, if you look at the income disparities that exist today, they are huge. The poor countries, or the 75% of the world population which lives in poor to middle income countries, has access to only 1/4 of the world's resources. Whereas 25% of the richer population of the world, that is those who live in rich countries, have access to or use 75% of the world's resources. And this is a huge disparity. In terms of per capita income, the numbers are also alarming. The average income that a person or a person makes in a poor country is $330 only per year, whereas the average income that a person makes in rich countries is $24,000. Huge difference. And this $330 is not the income level for the poorest country of the world. It accounts for 35% of the world's population. Now, many explanations have been given for why these poor countries have remained poor. The most popular ones have involved discussion of the vicious circle of poverty. And one way in which this could be represented is that because poor countries are poor, they have lower incomes. Because they have low incomes, they have low savings in the economy. As you know, savings are a function of income. The higher your income, the more you save. Now, because they have less savings, they can invest less. Note that in a Keynesian setup investment, planned investments have to be equal to planned savings. So the lower your savings, the lower your investments. Now, low investment levels mean that you will not be able to leverage the productivity gains, the economies of scale, the learning by doing economies that accrue because of large levels of large scales of investment. And therefore, the productivity remains low. So low saving, low investment, low productivity. Now, if you remember, when we were discussing the drivers of growth, we noted that in a neoclassical setup, the key driver of growth was, yes, the growth rate of the labor force and the rate of change of technology T. So the rate of change of technology, which in that context was called labor augmenting productivity, that remains low in poor countries because their level of investment or the scale of their operations is low. So if their rate of change of growth of productivity is low, that means they will not be able to either generate more growth because the rate of technological progress or productivity changes is the main driver of growth, and also they will not be able to sell their goods abroad. That is, their export will be low. The implication of all this was that your income level would remain low, and therefore your savings would remain low, and therefore you would be caught in that same vicious circle. That is, low savings lead to low savings, lead to low savings, lead to low growth, lead to poverty. And this was given as a very powerful explanation for why poor countries were poor. Now, two gap theorists, these were people who identified the main cause of this vicious cycle. And they said that developing countries suffered from two gaps. There was a foreign exchange gap, which was caused by the fact that developing countries' demand for imports or imports were greater than their exports. They could not export as much as they wanted to or needed to import. And the second one was that their savings, their investments were saving constrained. That is, they could not invest to the desired level. And they said that if these two constraints could be removed, and until these two constraints were removed, developing countries would not be able to get out of this vicious circle of poverty. There were other arguments that were presented for the low level of income for these poor countries. One was articulated in the form of the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. This hypothesis said that poor countries are involved in the production and export of primary commodities. And primary commodities face declining prices in the international markets. That is, these countries' terms of trade were falling. Terms of trade are simply the price of your exports divided by the price of your imports. So the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis was that poor countries were exporting things like cotton, rice, wheat, metals, raw materials, which faced a declining price in the international markets, whereas they were importing things like machinery, refrigerators, consumer goods, manufacturers, which were increasing in sort of real prices, and therefore the terms of trade of developing countries were deteriorating. And this meant that poor countries would continue to get poorer and rich countries would continue to get richer. There were other arguments as well. Some people highlighted the lack of human capital in poor countries. They said that physical capital or the lack of physical capital could not be a reason or the lack of savings or investments could not be a reason for why countries could not progress or develop or grow. And they gave the example of Western Germany. Western Germany was a country which was devastated by the Second World War. Yet, Germany, within 10 years of the war, was back on its feet and was a pretty advanced country. How did this happen? The argument that was given was that Germany, while it lost a lot of its physical capital, machinery, etc., did retain its human capital. So when it found the money that was given to it from the US through the Marshall Plan, it was able to use that money intelligently because it had good people managing those resources, and it was able to build back its economy. Poor countries have the problem that they do not have enough human capital. And the underlying reason for that is often argued to be the lack of education. Education levels or literacy levels in many countries are dismally low. Another argument that is given is social or ethnic conflict. And conflicts in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Pakistan and India have been caught up in a long political conflict. It has meant that developing countries have not had enough resources to allocate or devote to priority sectors such as health, education, infrastructure. They have spent a lot of money dealing with these conflicts, both inner and regional conflicts. And this was something that richer countries were not faced with, at least in the prime years of their growth. That's one argument. Another argument was that poor countries have higher population growth rates, and that puts natural pressure on the growth that per capita income can experience. If the population growth rate is very high, as you know, the growth in per capita income ipso facto falls. So this was also presented as an argument, and also that a rising population increases the likelihood for internal conflict, for social unrest, for problems like unemployment, and this complicates the task of the political managers of the country. And if there is no political or social stability, then economic stability is hard to get. There were institutional arguments given for poor countries under development as well, that these countries did not have strong institutions which could ensure that the society remained stable and on the right track. So institutions like the judiciary, law and order systems were not right. There was no meritocracy in the economy, and these things negatively affected the growth prospects of the economy. Another point was the lack of infrastructure development in developing countries. Many rich countries invested heavily in their transport and communication systems, their power distribution networks, and these greatly benefited their industrialists, their business sector. These advantages were not available, sometimes not available to developing countries or poor countries because they don't have the money to invest in infrastructure. They don't have the money to build motorways, etc. So this is again one of the arguments presented. A final argument that is presented is that developing countries or poor countries do not have the natural resources with them that could enable them to make some money and sell those natural resources abroad. So countries which did have natural resources, like the Middle Eastern oil countries, they made it big. Their living standards are far higher than the poor countries in South Asia or Africa. But one doesn't think this is a good argument, because there are countries which have had huge natural resources but have wasted them. Countries in Africa have had stocks of diamond, countries in reserves of diamond, countries in West Africa like Nigeria have sat on huge reserves of oil. Similarly, there are countries which have developed without the need or without relying on these natural resources. What natural resources did Japan have, or South Korea have, or Taiwan have for that matter? So this does not seem a plausible argument. But the other arguments do seem to have some weight, and they do seem to explain the vicious nature, the vicious cycle that poor countries are stuck in, that they have fewer resources, therefore they have little money to invest in human capital, infrastructure, and therefore and investment, and therefore they continue within that vicious cycle of poverty. Now, what are the suggestions that economists and different people have suggested for poor countries to break out of this vicious circle? And the first suggestion was that economies should grow through trade. We saw that there were gains from trade if countries specialized in the production of goods in which they had comparative advantage. And the argument was that poor countries should concentrate on goods like cotton, primary products, which involve a lot of labor, and because they have a lot of labor and less capital, then this will mean that their incomes will gradually rise, and therefore they will grow because of the leveraging of their comparative advantage. However, the experience of the past 4 decades reveals that the pursuit of comparative advantage, or this particular route to growth, has not proved beneficial for poor countries. And the reason for this mainly is that when poor countries wanted to sell these primary products internationally and freely to these rich countries, and the rich countries were supposed to sell back manufactured goods and capital-intensive goods to poor countries, the rich countries continued to give huge subsidies to their own farmers, which enabled them to not import these primary products from developing countries. That is, the international prices of these primary products were artificially depressed by the provision of large subsidies on agriculture and textiles by the rich country governments. And the size of these subsidies is truly enormous. The amount of subsidies that let's say the European Union spends on agriculture is higher than the entire GDP of Africa. So you can imagine the amount of subsidies that developing countries are pitted up against. Also, poor countries argue that once these subsidies were sort of begun to be removed, then new problems or new barriers to exporting to the rich countries were erected. And these barriers came in the form of environmental and labor standards, which prevented imports from certain poor countries. Then there was the intellectual property rights agreement, which meant that poor countries could not imitate. You know the old quotation that says, if you want to grow, you either innovate or imitate. So some poor countries which earlier could imitate some technologies, now they cannot because of the existence of the trade-related aspects of international property rights. This was an agreement that was reached under the WTO. So all these problems make it harder for developing countries or poor countries to pursue the comparative advantage route to growth. The alternative theory was that LDCs should use comparative or think of comparative advantage in its dynamic sense. And the example here can be given of countries in East Asia and some in Latin America. I mean, what comparative advantage did Malaysia have, for example, in shipbuilding? And now Malaysia is a big player in that market. What comparative advantage did Korea have in the automobiles industry? What comparative advantage did Taiwan have in the chip making industry? So all these comparative advantages have been developed by these countries. They did not they did not sort of just confine themselves to producing goods in which they had their traditional comparative advantage. They changed their comparative advantage. And this is the same dynamic versus static comparative advantage argument that we introduced earlier. However, it is important to distinguish between two types of arguments that advocated that developing countries develop their comparative advantage, that is, view it in a dynamic sense. The first were in the vein of import substituting industrialization. That is, they argued that because poor countries' imports were greater than their exports, it was important for poor countries to start producing the goods that they needed to import from abroad, and this would help them save on foreign exchange. The other approach was export-led industrialization. That is, you build your comparative advantage, but then you try to compete with the rest of the world. You try to sell those goods abroad. So in import substituting industrialization, you try to produce for the local market. In export-led or export-oriented industrialization, you try to produce for the rest of the world. And the experience of the countries which have adopted these two approaches, different approaches, suggests that the latter approach, the export-oriented industrialization approach that the East Asian countries developed or adopted, was far more successful in generating growth. The reason that is presented for the relative success of the export-oriented industrialization strategy relative to the ISI strategy is that when you're producing for foreign consumers, you have to remain competitive. That is, you have to compete with other producers who are also selling to the same international consumers. However, if you are producing only for the local consumers and your industry is protected through import tariffs, that is, no other imports are coming in, then you tend to become complacent. So import substitution industrialization makes producers complacent, raises their costs, and therefore it cannot be in the long-term interests of the country. Now, that was the one option, that was growth through trade. There is another option that was suggested, and that was growth through resource transfer. And as I mentioned earlier, the two-gap theorists said that poor countries had two gaps. They had a foreign exchange gap, which arose because their imports were greater than their exports, and they had a savings gap. That is, their savings were greater, their investments were greater than their savings. And the argument that was given was that if we could help plug these two gaps, then poor countries would come back and start growing again. That is, they would be able to overcome these two constraints and relieve the constraints on growth. And the example that was given in this case was that of West Germany, that after the Second World War, West Germany was given a lot of money by the US through the Marshall Plan, and this money was put to good use and helped rebuild Germany very, very fast. And so the argument was that if we similarly give money, donors or the people who were giving money thought that if we could give money to developing countries or poor countries as well, then they would also use this money to their advantage and start growing in the next 15 to 20 years. The problem that was not envisaged at that stage was that would the money that was being lent to these poor countries be paid back? Would these poor countries also be able to pay us back? This concern did not arise in Germany's case because Germany grew very fast and was able to pay back the amount. But it did arise in poor countries' case, and their debt problem continued to worsen. They never were able to get out of that debt problem. Some of these debts were highly concessional debts, some were commercial debts. The problem was that the utilization of this money was not as good as it was in, let's say, Germany and some other East Asian countries. And this became a permanent bane for these poor economies. The other reason that was cited for this continuing debt problem that these aid flows caused the developing countries to fall in was that the initial aid that came was not enough. Under the UN Charter, rich countries are required to contribute 0.7% of their GNP annually to poor countries in the form of assistance. And this was never met. Actual aid figures have been much below the 0.7% required ratio. For example, the US only gives about 0.1% of its GNP as foreign aid. And this might have caused, according to some people, an insufficiency of aid, that the aid was never sufficient in order to take those economies out of the vicious circle. That's one argument. Another argument is that the exchange rates of these countries, unlike that of Germany, were highly volatile, and they lost a lot of value. They depreciated by a lot over time, and therefore the burden of foreign debt in local currency terms multiplied. And this is true for many countries, including Pakistan. The dollar, for example, was about rupees 5 to the dollar in the mid-1960s, and now it's close to rupees 60. So a multiplying really of the burden of foreign debt that was denominated in foreign currency. Now there are also two other types of inflows that could come in as resource transfers. One was the private capital flows that we've been talking about, portfolio investments and foreign direct investment, right? There are two actually. Now the advantage of foreign direct investment, according to some, is that it helps relieve three constraints, not two. It helps relieve the foreign exchange constraint, it helps relieve the savings constraint, but it also helps relieve the skills constraint. When foreign firms come into the economy, they bring with them a skill set which is not available locally. They also bring with them managerial abilities. They also bring with them the information about markets outside the country to which exports can be made. So all these constraints can be relieved through the influx of foreign direct investment. However, as you know, in the early in the 50s and 60s and 70s, poor countries were hesitant to encourage foreign direct investment because they were afraid that these foreign investors would take over their strategic assets. So they kept them out. However, now there is a change of attitude towards foreign direct investment, and many countries are looking to attract foreign direct investment from abroad. As for foreign portfolio investment, we looked at the problems that these can cause in the context of financial crisis, in the context of speculation that can happen against currency pegs, etc., etc. So that clearly has not been the ideal solution for developing countries either. So my friends, we've looked at two possible approaches to breaking out of the vicious circle: the growth through trade approach and the growth through resource transfer approach. And we've looked at the particular problems embedded in these. In trade, we saw that comparative advantage theories were not delivering in terms of the gains for trade. In the resource transfer approach, we saw that aid was firstly not sufficient. Where it was sufficient, it was misutilized. Also, where debts came in, the debt burden became more and more humongous as time went on, did not go away. Foreign portfolio investment or short-term capital flows, not a solution because they cause a lot of instability. So is there a third way towards growth as well? Well, it can be thought of in the context of stabilization and structural reform. That is, if the economy can undergo some structural changes at the micro level, then it might be possible to superimpose good macroeconomic management on that and ensure that the economy grows very fast. Now, macroeconomic management, that part of the policy setup is called or is related to stabilization policies. And often we relate this to the workings or the policies that are dictated or set by the IMF. Whereas the structural reform part of macro management or micromanagement, as I would call it, is often sort of dictated or led by the World Bank. Now, the original functions of these two institutions were not stabilization and structural adjustment. IMF was formed in the 1940s together with World Bank at Bretton Woods, not to provide loans to developing countries and impose conditionalities on them, or to become active in their macroeconomic management. It was set up to look after international monetary stability. But this was a role that it sort of stopped paying a lot of attention to somewhere in the 1970s or after the 1980s debt crisis, where developing countries needed assistance from the IMF, and since then the IMF started involving itself into lending to developing countries and taking a more active interest in their macroeconomic management. Now, what was the purpose that the World Bank was formed for? The World Bank was formed mainly to look after the reconstruction that happened in Western Europe after the Second World War. And the World Bank was very successful in that activity. That is, it helped finance the reconstruction work there, and most of Western Europe was able to get back to its original position very fast, within 10 to 15 years. But once the World Bank had completed its task, it was in a way idle, and that is the time where it shifted its attention to poor countries and started getting involved in structural reform policies. That is how it could help these economies to be structurally transformed in order to increase their supply potential and their ability to produce more goods. So stabilization was related to the demand side of the economy, structural reform related to the supply side of the economy. By getting the aggregate demand equal to aggregate income or supply, that was the stabilization part of the policies. The IMF could ensure that the macroeconomic prerequisites to growth could be ensured. Similarly, by ensuring that the structural rigidities in the economy or the distortions in the economy could be removed in the microeconomic context, the World Bank wanted to ensure that these economies are able to then make the leap in growth that they are capable of making. What were the main ingredients of stabilization policy from the IMF? Let's first get the slide right, because this is indeed our third approach to development. The stabilization policies of the IMF involved higher interest rates, tight fiscal policy, and devaluation. Because according to them, the problem with developing countries or poor countries was that their inflation rates were high, that is, their aggregate demand was higher than their aggregate supply, and that they were running a current account deficit. So you can think of this in some quadrant of the Salter-Swan diagram I introduced earlier as well. And so the policy suggestion that they gave was that the government should reduce its money supply, which will help reduce inflation. It should cut down on its spending, which will alleviate demand pressures, and it should also devalue its exchange rate so as to increase its exports, reduce its imports, and bring about balance of payments equilibrium. Now, in reality, while these policies, the aim of these policies might have been right, their effect on the economies that they sought to stabilize was not very positive. In most cases, the contractionary monetary and fiscal policies caused the unemployment problems in some of these economies to exacerbate. So the poor were hit. And the poor were also hit because when governments reduced their fiscal expenditures, that is their spending, they did not reduce their spending on, let's say, defense or civil service or other expenditures. They reduced their spending on health, education, key areas which were important for the poor and also for the long-term growth of these economies. Finally, the policy of devaluation hit the exchange rate and the equivalent, the debt burden of foreign debt that these countries had incurred. And therefore, the problem of debt overhang became worse because of this policy of devaluation. So all of these three policies did not actually bring about the effects that it had hoped to bring about. Now, the World Bank's structural reform policies, by contrast, involved three points. It was privatization, liberalization, and governance and administrative reforms. Now, under privatization, the argument or the objective was to get rid of all these public sector owned organizations, banks and industries which had become very inefficient, managerial white elephants, and transfer that task to the private sector because the private sector could do it more efficiently. Well, again, this backfired in many countries because when you stopped or put an end to these public sector owned enterprises, many people were laid off, and this caused unemployment and exacerbated social problems in the economy. What about the other policies? Liberalization reform. Well, there was 4 types of policies that the World Bank advocated. There was liberalization of prices generally, that is removal of price controls, wage controls. There was liberalization of trade, so removal of tariffs, export taxes. There was liberalization of the capital account, that is the free movement of capital from the country inwards and outside was advocated. And finally, there was financial liberalization, that is the financial sector should be opened up both to foreign participation, and also banks should be allowed to set their own interest rates rather than the government dictating what the interest rate levels should be. The problem with these liberalization policies was that they were sometimes not well coordinated, or they were not sequenced properly. That is where financial liberalization should have come before trade liberalization, it came afterwards. And this confused the signals that the government was sending to the private sector. For example, if the government wanted its exporters to produce more, then it should have liberalized the financial sector, which led to an increase in the interest rates before it asked the export community to increase their exports. What happened in some countries was that the export sector committed itself to producing more exports, and then suddenly the government liberalized the financial sector, which allowed banks to raise the interest rates that they charged, and suddenly the exporters said, well, we were supposed to produce so much and we had done our costings based on the lower interest rates. Now how are we supposed to break even? So these kinds of sequencing errors, poor timing, also the burden of managing so many different types of liberalization reforms at the same time taxed the administrative machinery of the government a lot. That is, there were not enough people working in the ministries of finance and the different various ministries of the government to look after these different and complicated liberalization reform processes. Finally, the governance and administrative reforms that the World Bank put forward, some of them involving strengthening the judiciary, law and order organizations, strengthening civil society in the economy, civil service pay reform. Some of these policies, while desirable, were taken as rather patronizing by the recipient country governments. That is, governments were not comfortable with foreign institutions telling them what to do and how they could improve their judiciary, how they could improve their law and order organizations. And so this caused a problem of ownership of reform. That is, the conditionalities that were sometimes imposed by the World Bank and also by the IMF in relation to the fulfillment of some of these conditions and these reforms were not viewed favorably by the people actually administering them. That is, the people who were responsible for implementing the reforms of the World Bank and the IMF were not comfortable with this thing that these reforms were coming from outside and being imposed upon them. So because of some of these problems, the structural reform stabilization route to growth also did not materialize. And today the role of the IMF and the World Bank has indeed been put into question by many. Many say that the two organizations have not helped the cause of developing countries or poor countries, but harmed it in fact. Anyway, that was the discussion on the three possible ways that poor countries can choose to grow out of their poverty. We've looked at the problems, and the problems are many. And we've looked at the solutions, and we've noted that the solutions are not perfect. So what is it that we can take home with us? Can we say something intelligent about solutions for poor countries? There is indeed. And to this, we should now turn. Now, the first point that should be remembered by poor countries is that education is critical. It is very important to develop their human capital. Human capital is what determines how everything else in the economy will be managed. If your quality of human capital is good, then the growth and production chances of the economy will be much better. Then we noticed that export-oriented industrialization was a better way to use the growth versus trade route rather than import substitution industrialization. So it was not in the interests of poor countries to stick to their traditional comparative advantage, nor was it in their interests to develop their comparative advantage, but only for the sake of local consumers. There are also lessons to be learnt by donors or the people who have donated money to poor countries. And the lessons to be learned are that unless conditionalities are owned and accepted by the people on which those conditionalities are being imposed, then they will not be abided by. So it might be that the IMF and World Bank can do better with a few conditionalities which are accepted by the local regime, by the local, the bureaucracy or whoever, so that there are more chances of those conditionalities being accepted. So this is also an argument that can be given. Thirdly, governance, institutional reform, civil service reform, these are integral components of the overall reform process. Without a properly paid and competent civil service, it is not possible for economies to grow out of their problems. The policy makers of the economy should be well fed and they should be competent. Also, it should be noted that civil service reform or the task of a civil servant is no longer that of a generalist. It used to be once. Now, economics and finance ministers and the people working in there cannot be generalists. They have to be specialists in the field. Otherwise, they will not be able to deliver on these important tasks. Also, we noted that it is very difficult for poor countries to develop or grow if rich countries do not open their markets for the exports coming from poor countries. And this is especially true for primary commodities in which poor countries specialize. If these commodities do not find markets in rich countries, then these poor economies will never be able to grow. So the rich countries should reconsider their policy of heavy subsidies to their agricultural or farming groups, because this hurts the interests of a large segment of the world's population. Also, rich countries might consider forgiving the debt of poor countries. This has been done for much of Africa under the HIPC initiative, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries initiative, because it helps those countries forget about the ghosts of the past and make a fresh start. Otherwise, if you keep the old ghosts, keep revisiting the old problems, then it is not going to be possible for these countries to graduate from their poverty. Two final points. The importance of democracy, a strong judiciary, institutional setups is very important. To have a merit-based system in the economy. All along through our study of economics, we've looked at the power of the price mechanism. So things should be valued according to their worth. Meritocracy is very important to the good functioning of any society. जिस तरह के हज़रत अली का फरमान है कि कौमें कुफ्र के साथ जिंदा रह सकती हैं, जुल्म के साथ जिंदा नहीं रह सकती, और यहाँ जुल्म से मुराद है अदल की जिद. तो अदल जो है और जुडिशल सिस्टम और वो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है किसी भी इकोनॉमी के लिए. Also, one final point that developing countries or poor countries might wish to make note of is that while in their individual capacities they might not have a lot of bargaining power, but if they combine their influences together, if they form one larger bloc, they might be able to articulate their interests better and also develop more bargaining power, which they can then use as a leveraging point against richer countries. And therefore, that can also be used as a way of increasing their chances of growth. So, my friends, that is all that I had to say about problems of the third world or developing countries, or poor countries to be precise. Let's now have a final word about this course. Now, I've really enjoyed teaching you this course. There are a number of people who have contributed to the structuring of this course. I'm very grateful to them. If there are any shortcomings that have been left, anything that I have not been able to explain to you, if I have over-explained things to you, repeating them over and again, I am sorry for that. I am an individual. गलती का पुतला है इंसान और गलती इंसान से हो जाती है, तो इसके लिए माजरत खा हूँ. I hope you've enjoyed the course and learned something interesting about economics, that you feel more comfortable about looking at economic issues, about talking about economic issues, because that was the intent, the starting purpose of this course. I have a message for you people as well, a word of advice you can call. One is that things don't happen suddenly. Things don't change suddenly. Rome was not built in a day. So economic development cannot happen overnight. You, I, the poor countries, the developing world has to move slowly. It has to be confident that growth will eventually come. But it needs to understand that the investments that it needs to make today might not have their impact today as well. So, for example, things like investing in education, the effects of this might come to the surface in our next generation, but the thing needs to be done today. So it's very important for us to be not distracted from our long-term priorities because of short-term gains. That's one. The other is the importance of we the people. All along through our study of economics, we've highlighted that it's we the people whose actions determine the outcomes in the economy. And this is very true. We cannot leave it entirely to our government. We cannot leave it entirely to foreign powers or to God Almighty to solve our problems. It is us who have to take responsibility for our actions, and whose actions in turn will determine the fate, the collective fate of our country and our economy. Also remember, my friends, that biases, prejudices do not help in the quest for knowledge. So put your biases and prejudices aside when you are in the quest for knowledge. Be open to knowledge. Accept it from any source that you think is a reasonable source. Payghambar Islam ka farman hai, unzur ma qala, la tanzur man qala. Look at not what who is saying, look at what he is saying. So it's important for us to accept reason from wherever it is coming. We often form opinions about things that we don't know about. But remember that opinions without knowledge are like a car without a steering. So do not go for that easy route. Make objective judgments about things. Do not make subjective, sweeping statements about things. Make objective statements about economic issues in particular, because they need to be first studied, and then a position, an informed and sensible position, needs to be established on the basis of the knowledge that you've gathered. Also, there is a famous saying in economics that there is no such thing as a free lunch. And what that means is that there is no substitute for hard work. And it is very important for us to recognize that. As economists, you should not be trying to win free lunches. You should not be trying to make a quick buck. Your mentality should be to help the society generate the incentives for hard work and increase the returns to hard work. Because it's only through hard work that the prerequisites to growth can be met. Note also that while hard work is important and essential, it is not sufficient. You also need to be smart. You need to understand what the rest of the world is doing. You need to understand, if you are within an industry, what the other players in the industry are doing. And this is where I think your economic knowledge can really help you, in order to understand what the interests of the various players in the game are and how one can respond to those interests. Remember our section on game theory when we talked about strategic interaction between players. This is where economists can play an important role in understanding what the optimal strategy is that countries or policymakers should adopt in order to ensure that we maximize our gains in this world, which really is a kind of a game in which everybody is trying to compete against everyone else. Finally, my friends, I end where I began. I'll repeat by saying that economics is not all about money. And this is not just true for economics. The world is also not just all about money. There are other important things in life as well. Wealth is important. Monetary gains are important. But don't let the pursuit of monetary gains distract you from concerns of public interest. We spent a lot of time on public interest. We spent a lot of time looking at marginal social costs and marginal social benefits. So don't only think about marginal private costs and marginal private benefits. Think about the welfare of the society. Don't build palaces on graves. Money, my friends, is an important ingredient in development, but it's not the only one. और इसी नजरिए को अल्लामा इकबाल ने अपने एक बड़े खूबसूरत शेर में कुछ इस तरह कहा कि तेरी खाक में है अगर शरर तो ख्याल फक्र गिना न कर कि जहां में नाने जवीन पर है मदार कुव्वत हैदरी. कि अगर आपकी मिट्टी में चिंगारी मौजूद है तो फिर अमीरी और फकीरी की फिक्र न करें, क्योंकि जहान में कुव्वत हैदरी का मदार एक जौ की रोटी पर है. इसी नोट पे वील कंक्लूड. फिर इंशाल्लाह मिलेंगे अगर खुदा लाया. तब तक खुदा हाफिज और अस्सलामु अलैकुम.